Welcome to Isaiah 61. Today I'm going to be talking about bloodline cycles. A lot of times things happen in life, and for most people, they believe this is just bad luck or it's just circumstance and there isn't anything else they can do about it. Nothing in the spiritual realm is ever just a coincidence. Everything that happens in life is governed by spirits, whether that's for good or for bad. When we're born into a family and we're born into a fallen world. That family already has spirits operating in that family. And these spirits will impact all areas of our lives. That is relationships, financial, health, in every aspect of our business, in every aspect of our emotional or mental health. These spirits are constantly at play. So what does that mean for you? It means you need to pay attention. And sometimes for some people, they need to do spiritual DNA pattern. We call it the pattern tracing, to identify some of the spirits that are still tripping you up. So for example, if you've constantly started businesses and none of them has ever gone anywhere, if you believe you are extremely talented, but you're always being taken advantage of, if you have music, your rights are always being devoured by somebody else, if you have talent in something, it ends up that you tend to partner with business partners who end up stealing from you or taking everything from you. These are assigned spirits because there's something in you through your bloodline that is attracting this and it's governing your life. I know a lot of people who have, constant lack. Even when they have a lot of money, they still suffer from constant lack because they are suffering from a spirit of poverty which never leaves them. A lot of times, people who come from a spirit of poverty also have a tendency to overspend. And with overspending, they live beyond their means. And this is just, sometimes people say it is a lack of knowing or having financial acumen, which is not really true. We've had bus drivers who've ended up investing in the stock market and retiring very wealthy. So it's not that. This is because there's a spirit that is operating in that family that keeps everybody poor. And typically you find people who come from these families also have they constantly talk about the crab mentality, where there are other people in that family who are constantly pulling them down. Or if they have a big contract, there are other people in the family already calling them and asking for cars and asking for homes and asking for all kinds of things. So this is how the spirit of poverty operates. And the reason why it's so pervasive is because every spirit wants you to keep paying. Those altars are still active. They have never gone away. And you may say, how did the spirit of poverty come into our life? And it could be somebody in one of your ancestors or great grandfathers. Somebody somewhere made a decision a long time ago. We're too poor. Even saying the words creates a vow, creates a statement that vibrates throughout that bloodline. Every time an agreement is made with the universe, with the spirit of poverty, it stays in that family. If you've had situations where you come into a lot of money and then the money disappears, 9 times out of 10, somewhere in your bloodline, somebody made agreements and made a lot of money, which is not honestly. They took other people's money, they came into a lot of money, and they misused that money. And now that curse stays in the family. So a lot of times it's not because you don't have business acumen. It's not that you don't know how to run a business. It's just that you're constantly feeling like there's another force at play, and you're barely keeping your head above water. So let's start with where soul cycles, these bloodline cycles and soul ties are very active, which is in the relationship and love space, right? That is the area of life that most of them focus. So toxic partners, people who've been abused sexually, childhood trauma, emotionally, psychologically, they tend to be in very toxic relationships. If you've been abused as a child or anywhere in any time in life, you have a spirit of defilement, and therefore you attract the people with the spirit of lust. And these spirits will attach to those people because they have legal access and agreements with the spirit of lust, which turns into the spirit of seduction. So you always find there are always these toxic relationships that are happening, especially with people who've been influenced by abuse, lust, and defilement and seduction. Very short-lived. Betrayal and abandonment. Anytime you've had people coming from a home where there was a lot of betrayal, 9 times out of 10, the children feel the spirit of rejection. It's also been shown that when there's a lot of betrayal in the home, typically you'll find if a husband was always cheating on the wife, 9 times out of 10, the son will take on that same behavior, even though the son hates what the father did to the mother. So this is the spirit of rejection and abandonment, always abandoning. And when there's abandonment, most of the children feel that orphan spirit, right? They're left by themselves. And typically people who suffer from an orphan spirit end up being avoidance in life. At least in the culture, we call them avoidance. I think we're hearing now the term narcissistic avoidant, but it's not narcissism. It's just this orphan spirit. These are people who know that if they get too close, then they will be abandoned because that's what they have dealt with all their life. And so there are agreements in their bloodline with the orphan spirit that's very hard to get rid of. Then you have the push-pull dynamic, which is the spirit of control, the spirit of manipulation. This is the spirit of Jezebel. And the spirit of Jezebel is there to create a lot of confusion. People who are involved in push-pull dynamics never know when the other shoe is going to drop. As a matter of fact, they're always sitting waiting for the other shoe to drop. So if you're in this type of a relationship, we usually find a Jezebel is paired with an Ahab, somebody who's very passive, somebody who's very compromising, somebody who lets the Jezebel do everything and makes all decisions, and they just let them do everything. But a lot of times, if you are caught up with the Jezebel and you're not an Ahab, you will feel like you're going crazy. So you just need to understand that these people are being managed by the spirit of Jezebel and pay attention to it. The other one is we've talked about the finances and the constant lack, which is a spirit of poverty. The other one I want to talk about in finances is the spirit of being underpaid, undervalued. This is the spirit of oppression and the spirit of slavery. This is where people lose either their rights to their music, their rights to their creative work. They tend to do a lot of work for very little, and they're usually taken advantage of. And this is because they have a spirit of oppression or a spirit of slavery governing their lives. The other one is businesses, and when businesses come to collapse, the spirit of sabotage and the spirit of delay. This is where most people land. They quit their corporate jobs, they go to start a business, but the business never really takes off. They don't understand perseverance because they didn't come from a family where it was made clear that business can be challenging and it's important to persevere through it. So understanding that is what makes people successful. Owning a business is not always going to be profitable all the time. But if you have a spirit of always giving up, a spirit of delay, a spirit of I'm out of this, every time there's a hiccup, you're out of it. It just means that you self-sabotage yourself from opportunities because you're expecting them to be easy. But this is the spirit of sabotage. Addictions and habits. Now let's talk about the biggest ones are the spirit of perversion and the spirit of lust. This comes through pornography. The spirit of escapism and bondage. This is alcohol. This is substances. We can have, anything that you are constantly using just to escape your life becomes a spirit of bondage. Compulsions. This is where people are overeating, shopping, spirit of gluttony, spirit of emptiness. And it could also be spirit of escape. A lot of times people tend to overeat because they're trying to fill a void. People tend to shop and overspend because they are trying to escape. It's a feel good. In other cases, it's an image issue where we have a spirit of greed, so mammon, and then we spend a lot of that money to keep up with the image. So we are getting in agreements with spirits without really understanding what we're doing. So be aware of what your behaviors, what your will is deciding to do. The intention of what you are trying to do is always underscoring whether you're making an agreement with the enemy and the spirits or whether you're doing it for the kingdom. Health and body. So here we see a lot of generational sickness where we have the spirit of infirmity. This is barrenness, cancer, all kinds of diseases, autoimmune diseases. This is the spirit of infirmity leads to spirit of decay, which is ultimately death. Depression and mental illness. This is a spirit of heaviness. This is where the spirit of Python is playing a very big role in your thoughts. So you need to watch that because you're making agreements. Anytime you even say something like, this is never going to work out, or anytime you are constantly repeating the problems that you had with an ex or the problems that you're having with a partner, anytime you're constantly speaking that out into the universe, you're creating a frequency that makes an agreement with the spirit of heaviness, and that can be very detrimental in the long run. This is why we always say that once you're done with a relationship, just let it go. Don't keep repeating it. Don't keep repeating the agreement and the cycle of agreement with whatever negativity that relationship brought you. The spirit of burnout, exhaustion. These are people who are always striving and chasing. So around here, this is what we find. People who made promises to themselves that they will succeed no matter what. This usually leads to exhaustion, to burnout, and striving and chasing, we all know, is not from the kingdom. It usually ends up to just spirit of weariness and eventually just giving up. Self-image bondage. This is a spirit of shame. So a lot of people may be living in denial. So they live in shame, they live in silence. They don't want people to know the truth about what's going on with them. So this is where you can find people have subscribed to the spirit of shame. And whether they know it or not, that's what it is. Shame and silence go hand in hand. 9 times out of 10, silence will usually leads to disease when it's held on for too long. It's never confessed. It's never there's no legal, you don't separate, you don't sever all legal rights with shame and silence. That can become very detrimental, because 9 times out of 10 it goes into the next generation, without you ever even having to say anything. Just your silence is what creates the agreement with the enemy, and that can become detrimental in the long run. So we've even seen, especially in the self-image bondage, we've seen people who've said, well, during my generation, even if we were no longer together, we stayed together for image purposes. And I think that still goes on to this day. It's not, it's not far-fetched to find people who live this way. But we need to understand that you are passing on something to your children, and your children will either become totally the opposite, where they will never put up with anything, or they will adapt to the same thing of shame, and they will end up in cycles of relationships that they shouldn't be in, but because they're trying to keep up an image, because that's what's been passed on to them, then it creates this spirit of shame, and so they end up staying in relationships that they shouldn't stay. So that's the agreement there. When it comes to emotions and mental health, you want to watch out for fear. The spirit of fear that keeps you from either taking up opportunities, creating multiplication, especially if you're doing things in the kingdom. You want to watch out for the spirit of anxiety. This is the spirit of torment, the spirit of confusion, shame, which is usually the spirit of condemnation. That's who you're making agreements with. When it's anger, and I'm not talking about righteous anger, which is when you see something wrong that's being done and you take active steps to make sure that that never happens, or you're angry because something unfair is being done to somebody else. That is righteous anger. Here I'm talking about destructive anger that you feel towards somebody else and you want to do harm to them. So this is the spirit of retribution. Overthinking. This is the spirit of double-mindedness. Anytime you have an idea, anytime you want to see if something is going to work, just get on with it. If you keep doubting, the longer you doubt, then you're making agreement with the spirit of double-mindedness. Just do it, do something. It doesn't have to be perfect. Stop overthinking. That creates, as a matter of fact, people who tend to overthink tend to never start anything. They keep talking about it, but they never get on with it. It doesn't have to be perfect. Depression. This is the spirit of heaviness, as we've talked about this. And then the need for validation. This one is huge, because people with a need of validation actually make agreements with the spirit of rejection and the orphan spirit. So when they need validation, they show up, and then once they get the validation, they run away, because they are used to this orphan spirit. And a lot of times they may, they drive other people crazy, but you just need to be aware of what's working through that person. So divorces and abuse brings in the spirit of violence. So if your great-grandmother, your mother, if you've seen abuse permeating through your family, then that's an agreement with the spirit of violence. This is also an agreement with the spirit of covenant breaking, especially for divorces, right? There's some families where there have been so many divorces that people don't quite understand why it's so pervasive. The spirit of early death. This is the spirit of death and premature death. There are definitely some families where, whether we're talking about suicide or we're talking about family tragedies where people die young, this is the spirit of premature death. Anything that is repeating through the family bloodline is always a spirit of generational curse. So pay attention to that. And just because you're living a different lifestyle than the one that your parents lived does not mean that you have overcome the curse. We're living in a very advanced society. We're living in the AI age. And a lot of times we're finding that people are so shocked that they are so removed from the conditions they were raised in, and they have since gone on to have massive success in the family, and yet they are dealing with the exact same thing that their parent was dealing with. And there's almost like a shock and a disbelief. If the father had thoughts of, doubt, consistent doubting, consistent worry, consistent fear, we find that people, the children have since left and established themselves, and yet they are also now dealing with fear and doubt and just constant worry. They're going to lose their jobs. And yet this is somebody who you should expect to know, well, if your job goes away, then God provides another door and you find a business. So this is what we're talking about when we say life is spiritual and you cannot outrun what's running through your bloodline. Very true. So whenever we have, and then let's talk about the spiritual life, because this one has come up. You have a partner, and while you are so committed to Christ and you are convicted through the Holy Spirit, your spouse is not. They simply have a spirit of apathy. They have a spirit of lukewarmness with God. It's a hot, cold with faith. They're not maybe convicted, and that's the agreement that they're making with, that's the spirit they're making agreements with. They may not know it at the time, so you may want to sit down with them and talk about their spirit of apathy. And then resistant to growth. We have people who don't want anybody in the family to even try having a business. Why? Because maybe they saw their parents fail at businesses all their life. This is what we call the spirit of hindrance, the spirit of Python. Python is the one who creates a lot of thoughts, negative thoughts in your mind. And so when your children come to you and say, I don't want to go to med school, I actually want to start a YouTube channel. And I want to make it professional. I know I can I can live comfortably off the YouTube channel in the next 5 years. And you have a complete meltdown. You start saying how nobody in the family has ever had a business, and you just want your children to follow the same direction and become a medical doctor because that's who you are. So this is a spirit of hindrance. A spirit that does not allow growth will always be a spirit to hindrance. We also see this between couples where one couple really has a goal that they're shooting for, something that they want to pursue, but the other partner is not interested and is not encouraging. In fact, they would like for them to stop immediately and go on back to normal life. So this is the resistance to growth. This is the spirit of hindrance. And then bound to altars and vows. So this is where people have made vows, people have made covenants, people have spoken certain things. Like if somebody said, I hate having children, I wish I never had children. All these are covenants and vows that are made. That's why there's power in the tongue of life and death. So whenever these vows are made, a new altar is created, and this is the spirit of idolatry, or the spirit of bondage. So if somebody in your bloodline said, I wish we never had these kids, or I wish I'm not interested in having children, but in the end they ended up having children just to keep the marriage. 9 times out of 10, eventually it will come back in future generations as miscarriages. We see that a lot. So this is all that's covered in your bloodline cycles. And if you'd like a deeper framework in any of this, I'm happy to do so. This is just high level. So, yeah, definitely leave me a comment. Feel free to subscribe. We'll be bringing more spiritual intelligence to help you understand what's happening in your life, and wishing you a blessed evening.